right. I'll go here, live, here. I'm going to do. There we go. All right, people are joining.
I'm here.
All right.
Timed out for a second.
All right, everything looks good on the Facebook end. All right. Okay, so I'm going to get started. It's a little bit after 6:30. So good evening and welcome to a Great Michigan Read conversation event with Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, facilitated by Katie Wolf. My name is Jessica Luther. I'm the Assistant Library Director for the Alpena County George N. Fletcher Public Library. I'm also on the selection committee for the Northeast Michigan region for the Great Michigan Read. I'd like to thank Katie Wittenauer, Program Director for the Michigan Humanities Council, for her work on the Great Michigan Read program. The 2019-2020 Great Michigan Read is presented by Michigan Humanities and supported by national, statewide, and local partners, including the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Meyer Foundation. This evening's conversation will be led by Katie Wolf. Katie serves as the liaison between the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary and its local nonprofit, the Friends of the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. She is also part of the sanctuary's education and community outreach team. Prior to moving to the Alpena area 6 years ago to join the Community Foundation for Northeast Michigan, she served as Senior Communications Director for Michigan State University's College of Communication, Arts, and Sciences. As a former Executive Director of the Michigan Humanities Council, the Great Michigan Read program holds a special place in Katie's heart. For several years, she traveled throughout the state, including her very first trip to Alpena, hosting community discussions about Michigan's outstanding authors and books as part of the Great Michigan Read. Welcome, Katie. I am also pleased to introduce Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, author of the 2019-2020 Great Michigan Read, What the Eyes Don't See. The book was published in 2018 and was named as one of the 100 most notable books of the year by the New York Times. Dr. Mona is the founder and director of the Michigan State University and Hurley Children's Hospital Pediatric Public Health Initiative, an innovative and model public health program in Flint. Currently an associate professor of pediatrics and human development at the MSU College of Human Medicine, she's been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world for her role in uncovering the Flint water crisis and leading recovery efforts. She was one of the first to question if lead was leaching from the city's water pipes after an emergency manager switched the city's water supply to the Flint River in 2014. She is also committed to increasing literacy in Flint and elsewhere. Welcome, Dr. Mona. Following the discussion, Dr. Mona will take questions, which you can submit in the chat box. After this evening's presentation, you will be emailed a survey that we ask you to complete for Michigan Humanities Council and NEH grant requirements. And now I will turn this over to Katie and Dr. Mona.
Thank you, Jessica. And before we get started, I'd like to give a big applause to the Alpena County Library, as well as the Michigan Humanities Council and the Great Michigan Read program for making these types of important conversations possible. I can't imagine another time in history that we've needed to have these kind of conversations more often, and particularly with people like Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. It's so important that the message to me that comes out in her book, many messages, is how we all need to be activists and look out for our community and our children and each other. So I wanted to start with asking you to explain a little bit about the title of your book, because I think that's so powerful when you were working with your interns, and particularly today when there's a lot of discussion about science and what we should and shouldn't believe.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I first want to also echo what Katie said by thanking the library, thanking Michigan Humanities, thanking sponsors, thanking all of you for joining us virtually today. It's a gorgeous day in Michigan. I'm sure there's a lot of other things that you could be doing, although I'm glad that you're staying home and staying safe because COVID continues to be crazy, especially in the Alpena area, the kind of northern lower Michigan, but we'll get to that later. And it's, I've had so much fun the last couple of years now as part of this Great Michigan Read tour, visiting all parts of the state. And if you've read my book or if you've heard me before, I'm a people person. I'm a hugger. I'm a toucher. I love making eye contact, and these events are hard for me. So please know that I wish we could be together in person, but how grateful I am that we can do this together. And Katie, thank you for being my buddy here on stage, on this virtual stage. So thank you for that question about the title. So there were so many hard things about writing a book. So, when I went to medical school, like being an author wasn't like what I was going to be when I grew up. And it was just, there were so many difficult parts of the process and so many rewarding parts. But picking the title was probably one of the hardest parts. I had about 8 pages on a Google Doc of possible titles. And people are like, well, you have to put the word Flint in it, or you have to put the word water in it, or you have to put this in it. And I finally settled on What the Eyes Don't See. And there's a little subtitle, A Story of Crisis, Resistance, and Hope in an American City. And What the Eyes Don't See means so many different things. And I think, you could probably write 8 pages just on kind of what the meaning of that title is. It means the very literal. We don't see lead in water. Like, you guys probably remember those pictures of brown water from Flint. Remember those pictures of brown water filling people's kitchen taps, their sinks? That wasn't from lead in water. That was from iron corrosion, creating rusty colored water. Lead in water is clear. It's invisible. It's odorless. It's tasteless. What the Eyes Don't See also reflects lead poisoning. Lead poisoning is known as a silent pediatric epidemic. We don't see the consequences of lead poisoning right away. It's asymptomatic. It has no symptoms acutely. Its consequences manifest years, if not decades later. I have a colleague who recently called lead a silent assassin because you can't see it. Like, I wish we could, but we can't see it. So that's kind of the very literal meanings. And then the first time I heard that phrase is what you were referencing. I was a pediatric resident myself. So I was a doctor in training in Detroit at the Children's Hospital. And there was an attending who would always say, the eyes don't see what the mind doesn't know. And he would say that when he was yelling at us, when he was telling us, like, hey, you guys don't know, like, you're not going to make the right diagnosis. You're not going to take the best care of these patients if you don't know the whole world of possibilities of what could go wrong. So, if we were at the bedside in the intensive care unit and we weren't coming up with the right diagnosis or the right treatment, he'd be like, you guys need to read more because the eyes don't see what the mind doesn't know. So that's when I first heard it. And for me, that speaks at so many different levels, because as a pediatrician, I have cared for literally hundreds of children with lead poisoning, both in Flint and in Detroit. And before the water crisis, I never even knew that you could have lead in water. So I didn't know that. So I never saw that. And I never diagnosed that in my patients prior to this. I didn't even know that the word lead meant plumbing. Like, the word lead comes from the Latin plumbum. That's why the chemical symbol of lead is Pb. Like, I didn't even know the word lead meant plumbing, and it could be in water. But on a much bigger sense, the title, What the Eyes Don't See, really reflects our blindness. Our blindness to certain people, to certain places, and to certain problems. People had closed their eyes to Flint, like, oh, that's happening over there. That's, their problem. That's not my kids. They don't look like me. And they closed their eyes and they literally turned the other way. And this story really speaks to the power that we all have to open our eyes and to take action when we see injustices. So there's a whole lot of other things that the title means. It also reflects, like, who I am. Like, your eyes don't see this immigrant, this kid who wasn't supposed to be in this country, but who's here and who's, practicing. So lots of meaning to the title, but it's a mouthful.
It's a very rich title. It's worth reading the book just to hear all those different things. So in your book, you cover so many issues that in 2018, when it was published, weren't on the table. But now, I look at what's going on around us. We've got COVID, a public health crisis where people are questioning the science. We have the distrust in government and in the media, which has become pervasive. We have immigration issues on our border.
Yeah.
We have infrastructure. The president just released, a plan for
Yeah.
infrastructure. And then we have the big issue with environmental justice and climate change. And so many things make your book so incredibly timely. Can you talk a little bit about, when you wrote the book, you actually wove in lots of those themes.
Mhm.
But when you think in terms of the water issue, it really was a precursor to so many things that are happening today.
Yeah, Katie, that's a really great question. And there's folks that have come up to me recently who've read the book. They're like, "Oh my gosh, did you know there was going to be a pandemic when you wrote this book?" And I'm like, "No, we could have predicted a pandemic, although I'm sure some people could have." But yeah, it really speaks to so many of the national crises that we're in or that we were recently in. And that's absolutely one of the reasons I wrote this book. I did not write a story just to tell you about Flint and this isolated crazy thing that happened in that one city over here in the middle of the state. I wrote this book to really shed a light on the Flints everywhere, the stories of broken democracy. Once again, Flint was also this crazy democracy story under emergency management. There's anti-democracy things happening right now with efforts to suppress people's vote. It's a story about public health infrastructure and how if we don't plan and prevent problems, then we react to problems and we don't do as well. That's in the pandemic. It's a story about science, like you said, about how we need to respect science and scientists, and science needs to be at the table. And Flint was this kind of egregious example of science denial. We had fourth graders in Flint conduct the experiments that the state wouldn't do. And then here we are kind of with the pandemic, with the climate crisis, with the anti-vaccine movement, with these same lessons of how to combat science denial and to rebuild trust. There are so many lessons of this story that are kind of, not about Flint. And that is why I wrote the story. I wrote the story to serve almost as a playbook of how to be aware of certain injustices, no matter kind of what they are, how to take action, how to build teams, how to be a resistor, and ultimately how to create hope in communities.
So in your life story, and going back way before you, generational, it's like you have in your genetics that need to stand up to adversity. Can you talk a little bit about and the scientists throughout your life? It seems like those things were culminated in you.
Yeah, thank you. When I started, so I think the biggest shock that people get when they pick up this book, they're like, "Oh, this is the Flint story, right? Like, I'm going to read about Flint." And then the very first sentence is, let me get to it. "I am Iraqi, an immigrant born somewhere else, but not in Baghdad like my older brother." They're like, "What? Like, what is all this small family stuff? Like, why am I learning about her?" And the book started out to just be the Flint story. And I was going to tell you about my firsthand account being in the middle of this emblematic environmental public health crisis. And as I started to kind of share that story, it became really impossible. And I realized this real quickly. It became impossible for me to tell you what I did and why I did what I did in Flint without telling you who I am and where I came from. So there's a lot of personal history and family history, but lots of other history too. There's Flint history and Michigan history and labor history and environmental history and lead history. I was always taught, as a kid and as a student, that to really understand where we are, and most importantly, to figure out how to move forward, we have to start by looking back. And too often, we close our eyes to anything that's dark or uncomfortable, but only by kind of drawing from that past are we able to literally move forward. So, when I was trying to figure out why did I do what I did, or how did I become who I am, a lot of those roots are in my family history. So one of my favorite stories that I included in this book, and there's lots of rabbit holes in this book. I could have kept writing for 10 years. My editor forced me to turn in the book. But one of my favorite research that I did for this book was learning more about my great uncle, Nuri. And I'll tell you about him real quick. So ever since I was a kid, I'd heard stories about my great uncle Nuri, who was a radical, and he was like always on the run, and he was like, fleeing authorities, and he was always fighting one cause or the other. And in the 1930s, he actually went to school at MIT in Boston, but he got so excited about the activism that was happening there during the Great Depression that he got kicked out. And then he went back to Iraq, and when he was there, he founded a group called the Association Against Imperialism and Fascism. Like, I would sign up and be part of that group right now. He went to Palestine to fight against colonial rule from the British, and he found his way as one of two Iraqis in Spain in the Spanish Civil War as part of the International Brigades. So this was like the quintessential fight for freedom against Franco, against the fascists in the beginning of World War II. And because he had spent like a tiny bit of time in the US, or because he spoke English well, I'm not sure why, he was actually lumped with the Americans as part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So this is where like Hemingway fought, and all these like amazing folks fought for justice and for freedom. And I grew up hearing stories about my great uncle, and he also had a tattoo, and that was like the craziest thing my mom would tell me. He had a tattoo, but like here was this guy who, like, it wasn't about race or religion or country, but it was about doing the right thing, no matter how hard that thing was. So that's how I was raised. That to take risks, to look out for others. And I'll read you kind of this small part in the book about kind of how my parents raised my brother and I, with this perspective of being every day grateful to be in this country. Like, we immigrated here when I was 4. We immigrated to the UP. I lived in Houghton, Michigan for a couple of years. My dad got his postdoc at Michigan Tech, so like all over the state. Finally came down south to the Metro Detroit area. But I was raised with this perspective of being so lucky to be here because different things were happening to my first cousins back in Iraq. But also raised with this perspective, of being acutely aware of bad things that were happening in other places. And more importantly, recognizing that I had a role to play in making things better, no matter where my home was. So here's a little paragraph. It says, "We knew how lucky we were, and we knew how bad things could be. Challenging injustice means standing up for the weak, the vulnerable, the abused, and the forgotten, be it in health, employment, education, or the environment. It means being vigilant on behalf of people who are treated as pariahs and scapegoats, populations that are dehumanized, displaced, and treated as disposable. It means fighting oppression at every opportunity, no matter the place or country." Mark and I, so Mark is my brother, he's a public interest lawyer, a labor lawyer in Washington, D.C., doing great work. So Mark and I have reacted to our childhoods by involving ourselves in making things better. So his work is like in like courtrooms, and my work is in the exam rooms. But our work is the same. It's about, fighting for those who are more vulnerable.
I think that's a great kind of lead into the humanities component of your book. And you talk in there about how important it is to not just treat the patient, but to know that patient's story and the difference that makes. It's instead of taking that narrow view. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, I would love to. So today, actually, I had an orientation with my residents. I run a rotation called the Community Pediatrics Rotation still to this day. And I have brand new doctors in training. And my job in this rotation, in this experience, is to teach them about all the other things that impact health. So often doctors, this is also one of the reasons I like what the eyes don't see, but doctors are really kind of myopic. We only see like what's in front of us. We fail to really understand all these other determinants and risk factors that impact the lives of our patients. So, healthcare, medicine only contributes about 10 to 20% to health outcomes. It's all these other things like history and geography and economics and environmental conditions and the situation of their neighborhoods and safe places. All these other things play such a huge role in outcomes. Yet we often fail to diagnose that and treat that. So I give my residents, just like I gave them today, a poem, which is in my book. It's on page 24, and I love this poem. It was written in 1938. It's called A Worker's Speech to a Doctor. And it says, when we're sick, we hear, you are the one who will heal us. When we come to you, our rags are torn off and you tap around our naked bodies. As to the cause of our sickness, a glance at our rags would tell you more. It is the same cause that wears out our bodies and our clothes. So that was written in 1938. We've absolutely come a long way since 1938. But in so many respects, not that much has changed. The environments, the situations, the air, the water, the stress, the violence, the zip codes that people grow up in are still some of the greatest predictors of where they end up. So we need to realize that there's no amount of antibiotics or ventilators or ICUs that can save us, that we really do need to kind of open our eyes to all these other things that affects the lives of our patients, and we need to be involved in those spaces as well.
And in your journey, you have lived in several different places in Michigan. I mean, you've had an opportunity to get a real taste of as far, very far north up at Michigan Tech and the UP. Mm-hmm. And then you've been in the Detroit area. You teach in East Lansing. You work in Flint. You've had a lot of different communities. You went to school in Ann Arbor. And in some ways, they're all very, very different from each other. But I think when this case broke out nationally, one of the things that was really hard for people who lived outside of Michigan was like, what? You're surrounded by water and, people are getting lead in their water. I mean, it was hard to fathom how with all this fresh water in the Great Lakes, people were being poisoned with lead in the water. And so you look at that in Flint, and of course, everybody, including Alpena, everybody's asking questions, what about our water? So as a place to start from what you've learned, what do you tell community people who say, I'm concerned about my water, where do I start? Where is that? You've had all this experience now.
Yeah. I know way too much about water. It's like, which I didn't learn in medical school, obviously. But what I have learned is that we can do better. That, the regulations and the protections currently in place don't really respect science, and that there's absolutely opportunities for improvement. The last time I testified in Congress was right before Corona hit. It was like February of 2020, and it was about the need to strengthen the national lead and copper rule, which is part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The rule hasn't been updated in about 30 years, and the proposed revisions didn't learn the lessons of Flint. And didn't even mandate the replacement of lead pipes. That rule was actually finalized a few months ago. It was finalized in January of 2021 in the last administration. But fortunately, it was just reopened in this current administration to strengthen. So what I have learned is that we need to once again do better. And there are so many hopeful things happening right now, learning the lessons of Flint. Michigan has done so much. We have a model lead and copper rule, which specifically looks at lead and water. It exceeds federal standards. It's even better than the revised standards that were recently proposed. Michigan is doing a better job sampling for lead and water, and thus we have more communities who are finding lead and water because it's there. And we are mandating that in the next 20 years, all of Michigan's lead pipes are removed, identified first because we don't even know where they are, and removed. Michigan also, because of Flint, has some new positions at the state level. We have an environmental justice position, which is amazing. We have a person just at the state who's focused on environmental justice issues. We have a clean water advocate at the state level, and lots of other restructuring of our environmental departments. The very first executive order that Governor Whitmer proposed or implemented was a whistleblower protection order because of Flint, encouraging more state employees to kind of speak up when they see something that could be endangering the health and the safety of Michiganders. So lots have been done in Michigan to do better. Other ripple effects of Flint in Michigan and also nationally is the recognition of PFAS contamination. PFAS and PFOA contamination. PFAS is a flame retardant, still being used in many places, used a lot by military and fire departments. And the science is still like, there's still not like action levels. We know that's bad, and we know it's one of these forever chemicals, but there's not regulations. The EPA really has kind of stalled and dragged their feet on cleaning up, as well as some like former military sites. But because of Flint, we are learning, we're finding this now more. And Michigan actually has the most PFAS contaminated sites in the whole country, not because we have the most contaminated sites, but because we're doing a better job looking and finding. And what's really neat is our Michigan congressional leaders, because they were so active in the Flint fight, are now national leaders on the PFAS issue, because we've taught them about water. And they continue to be national leaders even now, especially with, as you mentioned, the most recent infrastructure bill, which was proposed not even a week ago. So the Biden administration has this jobs infrastructure bill, which is proposing getting rid of all the lead pipes in the country. And like, I'm giddy, like, this is amazing. And a big focus is drinking water. We think our roads and our bridges are bad in Michigan, and they are, but like what's underneath is even worse, because we don't see it. Another title reference, like we don't see that drinking water infrastructure, and it hasn't been invested in or cared for literally in decades. You go to also, like, for example, the East Coast, like the Boston area, when they dig out pipes, sometimes it's like hollowed logs that's delivering water. I was in Philly a couple of years ago. They had a water main break, and they're like, oh, this pipe was put in when Calvin Coolidge was president. So we have failed to really invest in drinking water infrastructure and to respect the science of lead. So there's a lot that needs to be done. If we know that lead is a poison that has no safe level, yet it's ubiquitous in our drinking water delivery system. We stopped using lead in our service lines not until 1986, but we didn't restrict the use of lead in plumbing and fixtures and brass faucets until 2014. The lead industry was very powerful and delayed a lot of these regulations, despite kind of centuries old science knowing lead was bad. So until we replace all of this plumbing, which is going to take a long time, there are things that the folks who are listening can do. They can run their cold water after periods of non-use. So for example, overnight, or if you've gone out of town for the weekend or whatever, you should always run your cold water until it's super cold, and then you're getting water from the main. So that's flushing. That should be kind of practice that everybody does to flush the pipes. You should never use hot water for cooking or drinking. Hot water from the tap increases the leaching of lead, so it makes more lead come out of the pipes and go into whatever you're cooking or drinking. So you should only use cold water from the tap. At the end of our kitchen taps, there's something called an aerator. I never knew this either. And it's that screw-on mesh thing. So we should make a habit at least a couple times a year to unscrew that and rinse it, because precipitates, especially lead pieces, scale, can get stuck there. One of my worst days in Flint was when we found out that this home for our foster kids and abused kids had like lead levels in their taps of like 5,000 parts per billion. And when they took out the aerator, there was a bunch of chips of lead in there. So we should all clean our aerators. And then the last thing that folks could do, especially if there's like a pregnant mom or a young child who's using this water for formula or whatever, or anybody with any concerns, is to install a lead clearing filter. You can install that right at the end of your faucet. You have to do it right before the water comes out, or use a pitcher filter. There's certain certifications for lead clearing. They're not all the same. And then those are other ways that you can limit your kind of lead exposure. But most importantly, we need stronger rules. We shouldn't have to do this if you live in Flint or Alpena or wherever. When we turn on your tap, our water is safe. We should not be drinking bottled water. After Flint happened, it was the first time in our nation that bottled water sales exceeded soda sales, because everybody in the country was worried, oh my gosh, what about my water? And we don't want to make the bottled water companies rich. We want stronger laws so that we have confidence and trust when we turn on our tap.
And so building on that, with our government leadership, and going back to really to the title of the book, what the eyes don't see, I mean, to some degree, it's what people don't want to believe they don't see as well. And we saw a lot of that in some of the government officials involved. Perhaps it was too bad for them to want to look into it and see what was really there. And your tenaciousness with combining the science, but the heart and the personal stories, I think had a lot to do with building the credibility and being that person. I was just listening to you and thinking, oh my gosh, we need to put her on the road for infrastructure because you've got that personal story, but you know the science as well. One of the things that I thought was surprising and so beautiful about your book was how you came around to see even your biggest adversaries as human beings and give them some level of, I don't know if forgiveness is the word, but acknowledgement that they felt badly. You know, and that to me, that was definitely a humanitarian moment several times in the book, how you, I mean, that had to be incredibly hard.
Yeah, it was hard. You know, folks often came up to me, they're like, how are you working with you know, the administration who, you know, they're at fault? Like, how are you meeting with these people? How are you standing next to them? You know, how can you be doing this? And my response is always like, I'm a pediatrician. My constituency is children. That is who I work for, and I will work with and meet with and, you know, whomever to get what kids need, because I'm going to have to work with that administration and the next 5 administrations. This is a nonpartisan issue. I just need to make sure I can do what I need to do for the kids. So it was hard, but the way that I was able to persevere that situation, and really all difficult situations that I encountered, was this constant grounding in my why. And my why is the kids. Like, you know, when I ask myself, like, why did I write a book? Or like, why did I go to medical school forever? Or why did I do this? Or why? The answer is always the kids, is my Flint kids. They are my why. They're the reason that I wake up in the morning. They're the reasons I do this work back then and now. So it's that constant grounding that enables me to continue to kind of keep that hat on, that I'm here for them. It's not about me. It's not about, you know, my university. It's not about this. It's not about that. It's about the kids. And it's what do the kids need?
Every once in a while, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Every once in a while, my system decides to turn off, so I got to keep remembering to keep things alive. So with the focus on you know, being able to really look at your passion and what motivates you, I think that's a really powerful message to anybody who is advocating. And you know, I look at some of the issues we have today, and if we could get past some of the personalities and keep focused on that issue, you know, we would be so much more successful in addressing them. But unfortunately, it seems like personalities get involved in that process an awful lot. So I think the one thing everybody probably is dying to know is, how's your husband and your kids doing?
They are great. You know, it's this pandemic's been crazy. Obviously, there's no words about kind of the pandemic and how unprecedented it is. But before the pandemic, mommy was all over the place. Like, I would be at the airport like 3 times a week, like advocating, talking, like, you know, traveling the state as part of Great Michigan Reader, doing all these different working, obviously. But then now I'm home a lot. And so it used to be like, Mom, we never see you. And now it's like, Mom, when are you going to go back to work more again? Like, we're sick of seeing you. So it's been a thing to be able to spend more time with my children, yet, you know, continue this work. I think a lot of us in this pandemic have actually been working more. You know, it's hard to be on or off, because, you know, we're always on, because like you always have your devices. But my family's, you know, they're great. I try to, when I'm home, I try to be home. You know, one of the reasons I put so much personal in this book. Like you learn about my husband and my kids, and you learn about, like, I'm taking my kids to soccer practice and Girl Scouts, and my husband had this shoulder problem, and and I'm trying to like be a good mom and a good wife, and be a good pediatrician and academic and all these different things. Like, I included all that, like, mainly like for a lot of, especially the young women professionals out there, because it's hard. And I think this pandemic has especially exposed how hard it is for women to balance all these different things. I mean, gosh, do you guys remember the December jobs numbers? 100,000 jobs were lost in December, and 100% of those were by women. Men actually gained jobs. And folks are saying that women are, the careers of women are probably going to be set back a generation because of the pandemic. So, I wanted you to see that I was just like you. I'm a regular person trying to juggle all these balls in the air, and and I did this, and you can do this, and sometimes work is here, and sometimes family's here, and sometimes family's up here, and sometimes work is here. Like, there's going to be ups and downs throughout life. This concept of like a steady balance, I don't think exists. But the way, I was able to continue my work was through having these villages of support, support at work. This book so much is about a team that came together to expose this crisis and work on the recovery. I continue to surround myself with a team of amazing people at work who are smarter than me, that help me do this work together. And I also have a team at home. It is hard to raise children and, to do all that other stuff. And I can't do it by myself. And I have lists of babysitters that I call on, and lots of other folks that help me. And I used to not do that. Like, I used to be like this strong feminist, like, I don't need anybody's help, I can do it, I'm a super person. But then shortly after having children, I'm like, oh yes, if you want to drop me off food, that's great, I'm okay with that. So I think it's really important to learn how to ask for help, and because people want to help, and that's the beauty of being part of a team in a village, is because there's going to be times when you're down and they have to lift you up, and when they're down and you have to lift them up. And I think I would just add that, this story also taught me that your teams can be unexpected teams. As a pediatrician, as an academic, I was kind of really siloed in my profession. Hung out with lots of other pediatricians, lots of other academics and educators. And I think one of the biggest lessons for me was how important it is to work with so many folks who are different than you, who come from different backgrounds and different disciplines. My best friend in the story was, a water engineer who could not have been more different than me. Like, literally, I think his family came in the Mayflower, like, super different political ideologies, like tall, good looking white guy. And I'm like barely 5 foot tall, pretty much living as close to Canada as you can get. I'm like, brown first generation immigrant. Yet I think he cared about kids more than I cared about kids. So, I think in this time, especially of kind of this political divisiveness that we're in now, is to find things that we have in common with folks, and they're there. It's easier to pursue those passions when we can do that with a tent that's really big.
It may be too early to tell. This is probably the last question I have a chance for, because then we'll go in to open it up to Q&A. But I was wondering if you can tell yet the impression what you and your team did in being able to bring this issue to light and get some resolution to young people, in their interest in pursuing potentially medicine or environmental justice or being a pediatrician. Have you sensed any of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I was writing a book, I had to pick an audience in my head. And at first I'm like, oh, should it just be like a sciencey medical book? I'm like, no, I want a layperson book. Like, I want to write something that everybody could pick up, no matter their discipline or background, and enjoy. And then I had to refine that even more in my head. I'm like, but really, who do I want to read this? Like, why am I writing this? Like, who's it for? And for me, it was young people. It was like students, especially, who could hopefully be kind of inspired by this story to make a difference in their communities. And obviously, when you write a book, you have no idea like if people are going to read it and like it. Like, I thought, like, literally maybe only my mom would read it and like it. So the uptake has been amazing, especially by students. So it's like the common read selection for so many universities. I zoom into classrooms all over the country every day, at the elementary school level, the high school level, like the college level. I was talking to postdocs, graduate students, so it's been amazing. And the breadth of disciplines that have also been engaged by this book. So yeah, obviously medicine and public health and environmental science, but also like African American studies and a geography class. I even zoomed into a university real estate class because they were talking about property values, but also about like historic redlining and block busting and how that, cut the tax base that, created a situation where the city was almost bankrupt. So like law, like the list goes on, and history, philosophy, creative writing. So it's been, so many folks have picked up so many different things from this book. And it's so heartwarming to get messages from folks who read the book and say, hey, because of your book, I asked about our water quality and we found this, or, I was inspired to go into X or Y. So it has been amazing. And I save all the little messages, and it makes all the work of writing the book worth it.
So can I cheat and ask, is there another book in the works? In the works?
Oh, that's a good question. So,
you don't have to answer them.
There is a new word that I learned from the publishing industry. It's called Youngification. So it's my book is being turned into a children's book. So there's going to be like a version for younger kids.
Oh, that's wonderful. Because I was thinking with the ages of your girls, when they would be able to read that and fully appreciate it. And they may be at a point soon, but there are a lot of young girls and boys that could really benefit from knowing this story now. That's wonderful. Well, Dr. Mona, thank you so much. I have appreciated an opportunity to talk with you. And at this time, I think I need to be able to turn it over to all the great listeners. And for any of you who are listening to decide if you should read the book, there's a quote on the front of the book that says, revealing the gripping intrigue of a Grisham thriller. That was from Oprah Winfrey. And I thought, really? A book about the Flint water crisis? But it really is a book that you move. I mean, you just can't stop reading. It is one of those. And as I would say, all of the Great Michigan Read books, they really are a great way to learn about Michigan, but also, how the humanities is just such an important part in our lives. So at this point, thank you again, and I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Katie.
Yes, that was wonderful. So if anyone has any questions, either here on Zoom or on Facebook, you can put your questions in the chat for Zoom. And if you are on Facebook, you can comment there. We did have a few people submit some questions ahead of time. Thank you. We're very excited about that. That was one of the questions we had was, what advice do you have for someone who is interested in becoming a pediatrician?
Oh, that's a great question. So it is the best job in the world. I literally wake up every day and I pinch myself that I get to do this work. I think a lot of folks ask me like, what should I do to prepare to go into medical school, or should I work in a hospital? Should I do my research? How do you think I should be best prepared? And my answer kind of really reflects on one of our earlier questions about kind of learning a lot about kind of all the other things besides medicine. So you're going to have a lot of time in healthcare training to learn about antibiotics and diagnoses and x-rays and all that important stuff that we need to know. But you don't get as much time to learn about where your patients come from, or the history of those places, or their economic situation, or how current events may play a role. And also, the critical intersection of public health. That's not a big part of medical school education either. So I tell people to read books. I literally tell people to read books. Pick up a book, read, literature, read the newspaper, read on current events, take writing classes, and whatever discipline you need to go into. You need to be a good communicator. I stayed another year in college to take creative writing classes because I love writing. And I'm like, oh, I'm never going to get to do this again. Like, thank God I did that. There's you get as much of a well-rounded liberal arts education as possible, because all of these things intersect into the lives and welfare of the patients and community that you will end up being privileged to work in.
All right, that's awesome. Yes, yay for liberal arts.
Go to your
education.
library. Yeah, go to the library.
So another question we had was, what connections have you made to your homeland that are similar to the issues of the people of Flint, Michigan?
Oh, great question. Quite a few connections, which I also talk about in the book. And I think one of the kind of most disturbing connection, which I talk about in the book, was when I was like 10 or 11 years old. My father showed me a picture of the massacre in Halabja, which is a Kurdish village in northern Iraq. And it was a picture of this a chubby little baby on the ground lying next to her father, and then they'd both been killed by this chemical weapons attack, and 5,000 people that died that day. And literally, like Saddam Hussein, like this terrible dictator, woke up that day and said, "I'm going to poison an entire city of vulnerable people that I don't care about, these Kurdish people." And flash forward 30 years later, like here I am in a city that's also been poisoned, and also a very kind of vulnerable population. I don't think it was purposeful, although there's people in Flint that actually say, felt like it was a genocide. Like they do feel that it was purposeful, that this happened to them because of longstanding neglect and racism and lots of other issues. So I think that was kind of one of the big parallels. But Flint, like Iraq, especially Baghdad, was prospering, was like a jewel of its area. And there's a lot of Flint history in my book, but Flint, not even that long ago, in the 1970s, had the highest per capita income in the country. The people of Flint made the most money than any other city in the whole country. Flint was a promised land. People from, immigrants all over the world came to Flint. African Americans fleeing the oppression of Jim Crow came up in the Great Migration North to Flint for living wages, for great infrastructure, great schools, for benefits, for jobs, like a lot of these things that we take for granted now, but a lot of these things we still don't have. So Flint was this beacon, just like Iraq was, just like Baghdad was. It was like this jewel of the Middle East, the birthplace of so many different things. And then also in the last 40 plus years has been spiraling in crisis.
Katie, do we have anything in the chat box?
Yeah, somebody asked, what is happening with the pipes and water currently in Flint? So that is a great question. So the 18 months that we were on the super corrosive water ate up our pipes. And when the EPA finally came in, they said it was like we were drinking through a lead painted straw, and you never knew when a piece of lead paint was going to come out, or lead scale was going to come off those pipes and into the drinking water. So they needed to be replaced. And through a lawsuit run by the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, amazing environmental lawyers, through state and federal support, those pipes are being replaced. It was supposed to be done in 2020, last year, but what happened in 2020? Corona. So that put a pause on those pipe replacements, but it's almost done. So this year, the pipe replacements will be done, and it will only be the third city in the country that has replaced their lead pipes. The other two cities are Lansing, Michigan, and Madison, Wisconsin. But like I said earlier, Michigan's replacing all of our lead pipes. We're gonna have all our lead pipes replaced in the next 20 years. And the ripple effects of this is amazing, because just this week, President Biden announced that they're gonna replace all the lead pipes in the whole country. Former Michigan Governor Granholm, the current Energy Secretary, tweeted today that we need to replace all the lead pipes and ensure people have safe drinking water. So the ripple effects of Flint are tremendous, and Flint will be leading kind of the nation because of our work already to replace lead pipes and teaching cities all over how to do it and how to do it well. So that's what's happening with the pipes. Because we're still in that pipe replacement process, the recommendation is still in place to use filtered water or bottled water, because whenever you move the earth or dig a pipe or do any kind of infrastructure work, it has the potential to release more lead from the pipes. But our water quality is absolutely much better. And once those pipes are replaced, they'll go back to kind of baseline.
We have a question. They want to know, how does the lead, what is the chemical effect? How does it actually affect the body and the brain?
Oh, that's a great question. We could spend a few hours on that. So lead is a neurotoxin, so it affects the nervous system. It mimics calcium in your body. So in many places where calcium acts, and there's many places, lead will take its place. And it specifically attacks the developing nervous system, which is young children. That's when your nervous system is happening. And it can last in your blood just a short period. It has something called a half-life of 28 days. It can end up in your brain for much longer. And then because it mimics calcium, it ends up in your skeletal system for decades, taking the place of calcium. And then in the future, like as you continue to grow and you make new bones, the lead that was stored in your bones can come back out and go back into your bloodstream and cause neurotoxicity all over again. So that's why things like nutrition is really important for the long term. So lots of kind of amazing science out there about kind of what lead does at a biochemical level, and the consequences of that exposure, the manifestations of that exposure are in many different kind of body systems, but especially in that nervous system in terms of development. So kids can manifest with learning disorders, attention problems, focusing problems, and they may manifest at different times. For example, like in 4th grade when they need to do higher order math and then they struggle. Also with growth problems, hormone problems, hearing issues, children exposed to lead as adults and seniors can present with things like high blood pressure and kidney disease and gout, and it's also been linked to things like Alzheimer's. So it impacts almost every organ system, and because of that incredible science, especially what we've known about how it impacts cognition and behavior, is why we've gotten to the point of recognizing that there's no safe level of lead, that even the lowest levels that we used to think were okay decades ago, we now know also impact neurodevelopment.
Okay, we have another one. We've got, so with the impact of the lead on the development of the brain, are there ongoing studies happening about the neurological development of the children?
Great question. Yes, there are. And we are funded by the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, to see how people are doing over time. It's called the Flint Registry. And people voluntarily enroll in the registry. So they do this really long survey to see how they're doing based on kind of standardized tests. And then based on how they respond, we get them connected to resources to help them, like health insurance, like mental health care, trauma-informed care, like literacy programs, like nutrition support, and all these different things that we know improve public health. And then we continue to follow people over time, over years to see how they're doing. So it's not research, it's a public health effort to follow folks longitudinally. We modeled the Flint Registry after the World Trade Center Registry, which has been following folks from that disaster for about 18 years now.
Can you talk about how people can learn resilience? You talk about that in your book.
Yeah, that's a great question. So our work in Flint really leans on the science of child development and trauma and early adversity. And over especially the last few decades, we've learned so much about, what happens in early childhood, especially if you have a lot of bad things that happen to you in early childhood. We call them kind of early toxic stresses, that those can leave scars almost and lead to like poor health outcomes later on in life. So the key is preventing those kind of things from happening. But if they've already happened, how do we get kids to bounce back up? How do we help families and children be more resilient in the face of these adversities? And that's a lot of the work that we're doing in Flint, is trying to support parents and children because of all these adversities that have happened. So that's why we have things like, home visiting programs and maternal support programs and trauma-informed care and mental health services and developmental support and all these different things to help families and children to be resilient in spite of these overwhelming injustices. And then and I'm sure Katie's going to put this up because she's amazing. I recently wrote an article for the New York Times called "I'm Sick of Asking Children to Be Resilient." So they published a series called "The America We Need," and really kind of visioning, like, in the post-pandemic America, which hopefully we'll get to soon, get your vaccine. So in the post-pandemic America, how do we create an America that's more resilient, that's more just, that's more fair? I think what this pandemic has exposed to so many folks is that normal wasn't working. Normal wasn't working for so many people, that they suffer all these inequitable burdens. So my article was, I'm tired of asking kids to do more because we have failed as a society to protect them. So why don't we do a better job creating resilient communities? Like, why don't we, support things that make people healthy rather than continue to spend a lot of money once they're already sick? So let's invest in public health infrastructure. Let's listen to science. Let's make sure everybody has healthcare that's not tied to their jobs, and when they lose their jobs, they lose their healthcare. Let's invest in things like early childhood, which we know has this massive return on investment and helps babies' brains grow. So how, as a society, can we create communities that are more resilient rather than putting so much more burden on our children? And there's a quote in this article that I love from a kid in Philadelphia who grew up in this like really troubled neighborhood. His friends were shot, in the projects, and he went on to become a Rhodes Scholar, and everybody was celebrating him. And this kid said, "Don't be happy for me that I overcame these barriers. Be mad as hell that they exist in the first place." And I go on to say, surviving life's hardest blows should not be celebrated or expected. Recovery and reconciliation require reparations and resources. To expect resilience without justice is simply to indifferently accept the status quo. So we can't burden, especially children, with this concept of being more resilient. Like, oh, just lift yourself up. It's okay. And even our Flint kids, when we talk to them, they're like, we've gone through so much. We just want to be kids. Like, especially with this pandemic, like we lost school, we lost, family members. We just came out of this water crisis. Like, we just want to be kids. Like, why is this happening to us? And we have to do better on their behalf.
Okay, we have a question from Facebook. Can lead affect the development of an unborn child if the mother is exposed to it?
Yes, lead crosses the placenta. So it does. It has a lot of maternal fetal complications. One of the first abortion pills was actually a lead pill. In the 1890s, there was a lead and water disaster in northern England, and they noticed a lot of the women lost their babies. So because of that, they invented a pill, which was a lead pill that induced abortions. There's articles in the British Medical Journal about that. It's been associated with prematurity, low birth weight, stillbirths, and it does also cross the placenta and cause neurotoxic effects as well.
Another question, have you felt any repercussions of how honest you are in the book? And as a
So,
person.
Yeah. So I think people are surprised. They're like, wow, she just really put herself all out there, you know? And I think when they hear me speak, they're like, oh, you sound just like the book. I'm like, yeah, like I wanted you to hear me. And the best part was I got to record my audiobook. So you really did get to hear me. So, you know, I didn't want to come off as somebody who was like, oh, look at her, she's amazing. Nobody can ever be like her. I wanted you to see me as a regular person. And thus, if I am relatable, then you know, then it hopefully it you know, it conveys this ability that you can do this too.
All right, we have another question from Facebook. Can you tell us about your first aha moment that there may be lead in the water?
Oh, that first aha moment was in my kitchen with my high school girlfriend who said, hey, Mona, the water's not being treated properly. And there's, you know, I saw this memo from a trusted colleague, former colleague of mine who said there's going to be lead in the water. And that is exactly the moment that my life changed. You know, I can tell you the date, the time, it's in the book. Like that, I stopped sleeping, I stopped eating, I lost 40 pounds, I lived unhealthy, and it became this constant kind of quest to find out what was happening with our kids and how to protect them. So that was kind of, it was just the mention of lead, because I respect the science, I know what it does, I know it's a form of environmental injustice. You know, we talked already about the science. That's what, you know, that's what it can do to one kid, and imagine what it can do to a population of children. So being grounded in the kids, that was my aha moment.
Do you have another? Go ahead.
Let's see. We have a few other questions. I think we'll take these 4 questions and then probably wrap up because we're coming in on an hour here. We have, was there anybody who attempted to stop you from pursuing your dream?
Oh, pursuing my dream. Say that. Like, I think that, you know, there's challenges and obstacles along the way, just like for everybody else. But I think if you are grounded in your dream, you know, you should always try to achieve that and persevere. So I don't think there's anybody that tried to stop me. I was also blessed with having so many wonderful mentors and folks who supported me, especially a lot of women in my kind of career path that helped me. Teachers are awesome. Thank you, teachers.
Let's see. Are there any ongoing activities in Flint to address the effects on the residents that would benefit from support from local people here?
Thank you. So yeah, we have lots of ongoing things that are happening. You know, breastfeeding programs, literacy efforts, you know, the list goes on of the things that we are trying to do. Because when you understand the science of lead and trauma, you understand that it's long term. So this work has to continue for the long term. One of the other reasons that I wrote my book is part of the proceeds go to our Flint Kids Fund, which is at our community foundation. So yay for Katie with the community foundation connection. So our community foundation runs the Flint Child Health and Development Fund, which has been supporting a lot of these interventions for the children. But I don't want you to help Flint. Like, if you want to, fine, donate to Flint, help us, that's awesome. But I think the biggest lesson of the story is that there's something in your community. There's something in your backyard, in your neighborhood, you know, in your city that needs you, that needs your voice, that needs your activism, that needs your efforts. There's kids in your community that could also use you. So if you want to give to Flint, thank you. And I can even share more details. But there's lots of stuff happening, I'm sure, where you are as well.
We have another question. As someone entering the medical field, how do you bring activism into your career?
Yeah, activism is why I went into medicine. You know, I wear lots of different hats as a doctor. I'm a clinician, I see patients, I'm a researcher, I'm an educator, but I'm also an advocate and an activist. It's part of how I was trained, especially as a pediatrician. It was part of my professionalization, is learning how to be an advocate and how to speak up for children and how to elevate the voices of children. It's not part of every medical specialty, but it's definitely part of pediatrics. And then I further kind of got more training. I went on and got my public health degree in health policy, because as much as I love caring for one kid at a time, I knew that I wanted to be able to have the tools to step back and care for a population of children. It's been said that pediatricians are the ultimate witnesses to failed social policies, because it's in our exam rooms that we see all these kind of social consequences manifesting in the bodies of our children, and most importantly in their potential. So you are an advocate. You can be an advocate. You don't have to be, but you absolutely can be. And I think one of the lessons of my story, or the Flint story, is that when the doctor spoke, things finally happened, and it shouldn't have been that way. Obviously the crisis never should have happened. It definitely should have ended when the first mom raised a jug of brown water. But when somebody in that white coat with lots of degrees after her name said something, finally, took a while, finally things started to change. So when I talk to doctors and medical students, I remind them that they have power, that they are a privileged member of their community, and that they have to use their voice and to speak up in partnership with community. And I think we've seen that in the pandemic. We've seen the trusted voices of doctors, being part of these national conversations.
One of the things I just have to add to that I found so impressive about the book is that you really used your practice of scientific discovery toward your activism as well. I mean, you were you thought things through. You looked at people who had different connections. You thought in terms of the chain of command, so to speak, and making sure that you didn't distract your activism by making a thoughtless mistake. I mean, so I think for people interested, your book is also a great book to read about effective activism, because you really lay out several steps so beautifully in your book.
Yep.
Okay, let's see. We have two more questions and then we will wrap up. What types of educational services have been made available to the children affected by this crisis?
Oh, that's a great question. Obviously, this was all upended with the pandemic, obviously, with kind of breaking educational services. So the schools, the Flint schools, were sued by the ACLU, kind of because they, saying they weren't doing a good enough job, kind of finding the kids and supporting the kids that needed help. As part of that settlement, more resources kind of went into the schools, but also there was the creation of something called the Neurodevelopmental Center for Excellence, which works in partnership with the schools, or tries to better identify the kids that need help. So it's really kind of thorough neuropsych assessments that then can also be used by the schools. There's also other kind of neat things happening in the schools. A lot of kind of school nutrition programs have been expanded, because remember we talked about the role of calcium and how nutrition is really important. We also do a lot of mindfulness programming in our schools. So Flint is one of the first mindful communities in the country, and one of the first 4 cities where everybody's been trained in mindfulness. And kids in schools actually do a lot of this mindfulness education. School health services have been significantly expanded after the water crisis. That was kind of one of our first set of asks. So lots have been put into place in schools, but not enough. Flint schools have kind of this massive exodus of students that's been happening for years. Less than 1/3 of Flint students actually go to Flint schools. They go to kind of out district schools or charters. So that has made it also kind of, when a kid leaves, the dollars leave too. So there's been lots of challenges.
Let's see. And then our final question, can you speak a little more about the PFAS situation in our water?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly what's happening in your water, but I do know that, as I said earlier, PFAS is being found all over the state, especially in the northern thumb area. And that's partly because Michigan has some really aggressive testing, which is not nationally mandated at all. PFAS is, like I said, this forever chemical. It's you can't get rid of it. It causes a lot of even multi-generational problems, lots of endocrine problems, hormone problems, thyroid problems, lots of issues. There's not even a great way to detect it. in the body, or not even great ways to detect it in the water. So we're learning more about it, and what we're finding is that really it's everywhere, and that we need to all be kind of better advocates to get it out, to hold the industries accountable. The polluters are still here, and a lot of Michigan legislation makes it very hard to hold polluters accountable. So we need to kind of, we all need to learn more. I would also urge you to kind of talk to your elected officials, especially your Congress folks, and kind of have them support, more resources to test and to clean these places up, and support the folks who are impacted.
Thank you. All right, well, this has been, I want to just thank you, Katie, and thank you, Dr. Mona. This has been just such a wonderful evening having you both here. It's been an amazing experience. I'd like to thank Katie Wittenauer, who's the program director for the Great Michigan Read. She helps make all of this possible for us. I'd also like to once again thank the Michigan Humanities Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Meyer Foundation. What the Eyes Don't See is available for checkout at the library. We also have book club kits for you if you're interested in using those. The book is also for sale at Parallel 45 Books and Gifts in downtown Alpena. We hope you'll join us for the 2021-2022 Great Michigan Read, The Women of the Copper Country by Mary Doria Russell. To learn more about other programs the library is offering, visit our website, www.alpenalibrary.org, or our Facebook page, and keep an eye out for that survey I'll be emailing out to you. Thank you all, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Dr. Mona, and thank you, Katie.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep reading.